Autumn painted the forest in bright shades of gold and ruby. The crowns of the trees, densely covered with leaves, slowly lost their former splendor, carpeting the ground with a soft blanket. The wind lazily rustled the branches, creating a quiet whisper that accompanied anyone who dared to step into these realms of nature. In this place, far from the noise and bustle of cities, Kaylin Ellis felt free. Here, on the winding path that wound through the dense thicket, she always found solace. The 20-year-old girl with thick chestnut hair and a thoughtful gaze loved the solitude of these walks. Each step, each movement became a ritual for her, a way to forget and merge with the surrounding world. In her hands was a notebook in which she often wrote down her thoughts or made quick sketches of what she saw. But today she barely noticed the details of nature. Her thoughts wandered far away, intertwining with memories of recent arguments with her mother, of the loss of her father, who was not only a parent but also a mentor. Silence seemed to envelop her from all sides. But suddenly this fragile peace was broken by a strange sound. A piercing, mournful cry came from the depths of the forest, making Kaylin stop. She froze, listening. The sound was faint but distinctly audible. It was not a human voice, more likely an animal in trouble. Her heart beat faster. A slight tremor ran through her body, but it was more from anticipation than fear. Kaylin could never walk away if she felt someone needed help. She had seen her father save animals many times, and those moments remained forever in her memory. "Nature needs us just as much as we need it," he often said. These words echoed in her head every time she faced a choice. The sound repeated, this time louder. Her gaze involuntarily turned to the direction it came from. The path she was on led in the opposite direction. Leaving the route was dangerous, especially alone, but the uncertainty lasted only a moment. Clenching her fists, Kaylin headed deeper into the forest, carefully stepping over branches and thick bushes. With each second, the sound became more distinct and the tension grew. Her steps quickened, and her heart pounded, echoing that strange cry. The forest around seemed even denser and darker, branches catching at her clothes as if trying to stop her. She looked back several times, feeling an indefinable unease. What awaited her ahead? Soon Kaylin emerged onto a small clearing surrounded by a dense ring of trees. There in the very center was a bear cub. Its paws were caught in a metal trap, and its body trembled with pain and fear. It whimpered, pitifully and piercingly, as if begging for help. Kaylin's heart tightened. She knew she had to do something, but she understood the risk it entailed. The clearing was eerily quiet, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. Each of her steps, now, could be fatal. The bear cub noticed her and froze, its big eyes full of terror, meeting hers. This moment stopped time. Kaylin slowly crouched down, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Shoo, it's okay," she whispered, though she herself was not sure of it. Around her, nothing had changed, but the sense of impending danger became almost palpable. Kaylin knew, where there was a bear cub, its mother was never far away. Suddenly, her whole world focused on one task: freeing the little one from the trap without arousing the anger of the enormous grizzly that could appear at any moment. The clearing was filled with a tense silence, broken only by the soft whimpering of the bear cub. Its small body trembled, its paw, caught in the trap, bleeding, leaving drops on the damp ground. Kaylin stood at the edge, her heart pounding wildly. Just a moment ago, she had confidently moved forward, but now fear paralyzed her movement. The forest, so familiar and cozy, suddenly turned into an unknown and threatening opponent. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I can't leave him here," she whispered, looking at the bear cub. Its gaze, full of pain and helplessness, seemed to pierce her very soul. Her father had once said that wild animals sense a person's intentions. "Don't show fear, Kaylin. They sense it just like you do," his words echoed in her memory. Taking the first cautious step forward, she felt the leaves and branches under her feet crunching loudly in the eerie silence. The bear cub jerked, looking at her fearfully, but too weakened to calm down. Kaylin stopped and spoke softly. "Shh, little one. I'll help you. Her voice trembled, but there was more confidence in it than she expected. Approaching closer, she knelt down. The trap was large and rusty, but its metal teeth had sunk deep into the bear cub's flesh. She carefully reached out to it, trying not to make sudden movements. The bear cub tensed at first, but then, as if sensing she was not an enemy, relaxed its resistance. Its breathing was rapid and irregular, but there was a hint of hope in its eyes. Kaylin looked at the mechanism. Opening it by hand was not easy. The metal was rusty, and the spring was still powerful. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, which she always carried with her. Thanks, Dad, she thought, as her father insisted she take it into the forest. Kaylin began to carefully pry the teeth apart, simultaneously trying not to cause the animal more pain. Time seemed to slow down. Each of her gestures was measured and careful. But suddenly the forest came alive. Branches behind her swayed, and there was a crackling of bushes. Her body tensed, and her hands froze over the trap. She's here, Kaylin thought, barely daring to look. The bear cub also sensed the approach. Its eyes widened in fear, and it tried to jerk, but immediately yelped in pain. Kaylin knew she had to act quickly. Focusing again on the mechanism, she pressed hard on the knife, releasing one spring. The trap loosened slightly, but it was not enough. The steps behind her grew closer. She could swear she heard a deep breath, like a threatening growl. Her heart beat faster, but her hands remained steady. One final tug, and the trap released. The bear cub's paw was free. It whimpered softly, but, too weak, slumped back to the ground. Kaylin quickly moved the trap aside, hoping this would momentarily calm the mother, though she knew the bear cub was free. She rose slowly and cautiously, looking around. The dense undergrowth seemed impenetrable, but she knew the mother bear was already nearby. Suddenly, everything fell silent. No barges, no wind, no rustling. The silence was deafening, like a harbinger of something inevitable. And then she heard it, a deep growl that echoed across the clearing. Kaylin froze. Her body stilled, but her mind was already working. She knew it would be pointless to run. Instead, she raised her hands, palms forward, to show she meant no harm. Easy, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. From behind the trees emerged an enormous figure. The mother bear. Her black eyes looked straight at Kaylin, full of anger and fear. The grizzly took a step forward, her massive body moving with threatening grace. Between them, there were no barriers, no protection, only a void filled with tension. Kaylin remained in place, her breathing shallow, but she could not hide her trembling. She knew her only hope was to show the bear that she was not an enemy. But how long would this fragile balance last? The imposing figure of the mother bear fully emerged from behind the trees, and the tension seemed almost palpable. Her fur shimmered in the light, filtering through the canopy, her massive body moving with a grace that inspired both admiration and fear. Kaylin, standing still, felt her heart beating so loudly it seemed to echo across the clearing. The bear's eyes, dark and sharp, looked intently at the girl. It was as if she saw not only her body but all her intentions. It was a battle of gazes, in which Kaylin could only hope for the thin connection that sometimes arises between a human and a wild creature. Behind her, the bear cub whimpered softly. This sound seemed to sharpen the situation. The mother bear raised her head, baring her teeth in a low, warning growl. Kaylin raised her hand a little higher, showing she had no weapon or intention to harm. Easy, she whispered, her voice trembling with tension. It's okay. Your little one is fine. She knew every movement she made now mattered. One wrong move, and the mother could attack. But instead of that, the mother bear took another step forward, her gaze darting to the bear cub behind the girl. Seeing that it was free from the trap, she paused, as if observing the scene. Kaylin remembered her father's lessons. He always said that wild animals sense when a person acts with good intentions. They don't understand our words, but they feel our hearts. His voice echoed in her memory, as if he were standing right behind her. The girl realized that now she needed not only to stay calm, but also to demonstrate a confidence she did not feel. The mother bear tilted her head slightly, and this small movement gave Kaylin a glimmer of hope. She slowly knelt down to show she was not a threat. Slowly, smoothly, she moved a few steps to the side, leaving the bear cub in the open space. Her heart screamed to get away as quickly as possible, but her mind kept her in place. The bear cub, still on the ground, made a soft, plaintive sound, and its mother suddenly focused all her attention on it. The grizzly moved forward, but her gaze never left Kaylin. The girl felt a cold sweat trickling down her back. She took another step back, her movements exaggerated and smooth. "I helped him," she said almost in a whisper, as if the words could somehow reach the bear. When there were only a few steps between them, the mother bear stopped. Her massive body was tense, ready for action, but her eyes no longer held the fury that had flared up at the beginning. She leaned down to her cub, sniffing it, checking that it was okay. The bear cub, feeling her closeness, weakly reached out to its mother, its small paw barely touching her. This was the moment when Kaylin realized that her actions might have saved her life. She felt the tension easing slightly, but it was still too early to leave. She slowly stood up, not breaking eye contact with the mother bear. The forest around was still quiet, but this silence no longer felt friendly. It was a fragile peace that could be broken by any sound. The grizzly raised her head, her eyes meeting Kaylin's again. In that gaze was something primal, but not aggressive. Perhaps it was understanding. The girl stood still, praying that this fragile connection between them would not be broken. The wind gently swayed the trees, as if it too had paused, watching the scene. Finally, the mother bear returned to her cub and gently nudged it with her nose, indicating it was time to go. Her enormous paws moved across the ground with surprising lightness, leading the bear cub into the shade of the trees. Kaylin stood still, not moving, until their figures disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to take a deep breath, feeling the tension leave her body. The forest came back to life. Birds sang, and a light wind brought the rustling of leaves. Kaylin looked at the spot where the trap had lain and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. She knew this day had changed her forever. She turned and slowly made her way back to the trail, feeling the weight of the events still lingering in the air. But deep within her, a quiet feeling arose. She had made the right choice. The trail Kaylin had left behind now seemed distant and unreachable. Her steps, penetrating the depths of the forest, blurred the boundary between the familiar and the unknown. Returning to everyday life after what had happened seemed impossible. She still felt the tension in her skin from those moments when her life hung by a thread, when her gaze and the bear's met as if the soul of a human and a wild creature intertwined. Her feet moved mechanically through the dense thicket, her thoughts returning again and again to the clearing where the trap and the memory of the mother bear remained. The forest no longer seemed so welcoming. The trees grew taller, and every sound caused a tremor in her chest. She understood that nature was now evaluating her, perceiving her, or conversely, perceiving her as one of its own. Her breathing became calmer, but her heart still beat with notes of the recent fear. She knew she needed to return to the main trail, but the landmarks had lost their clarity. She turned her head to look around, but the forest looked the same from all sides. Panic began to rise within her, but Kaylin immediately suppressed it. She remembered her father's words. The forest can be your ally if you learn it. Listen, feel, and it will show you the way. She tried to catch familiar sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out, drawing her attention. That was what she needed. The sounds of nature began to fill her consciousness, helping her map out the path. She moved towards the sound, carefully stepping on the soft carpet of moss and fallen leaves. But the forest was not going to let her go so easily. Suddenly, everything around fell silent again. A light wind rustled the treetops, but brought no familiar noise. She froze, feeling something had changed. A slight sense of protection, like thin ice, began to envelop her from within. And then ahead there was a crackling sound, Against the backdrop of silence, it seemed thunderous. Kaylin tensed, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up from an indefinable sensation. Her first thought was that the mother bear might have returned. She felt a scent or decided to follow whoever had approached her cub. The steps ahead grew louder, and Kaylin froze, pressing herself against the nearest tree. She knew running would be foolish. A deep breath helped her regain composure, but her body remained tense like a taut rope. From behind the trees emerged a figure, but it was not a bear. Kaylin tensed even more when she saw a man. He was in dirty clothes, with a shotgun slung over his shoulder, which seemed entirely natural to him. His face expressed something between irritation and complexity. He was looking for something or someone. Kaylin immediately realized she was facing a poacher. This explained the trap in which the bear cub had been caught. Her heart raced again, but this time not from fear but from anger. She knew such people came to the forest not to protect nature, but for gain. Their greed and cruelty left no room for compassion. She froze, not wanting to draw attention to herself. The man seemed not to notice her. He looked around, checking the tracks on the ground, and muttered something to himself. His appearance suddenly made the forest even more hostile. Every rustle and movement seemed dangerous to her. Kaylin knew she had to leave. She slowly began to move, trying not to make any noise. But her foot caught a dry branch, and it broke with a crunching sound. The man instantly turned around, his eyes cold and suspicious. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, taking a step forward. Kaylin froze, but then her instincts took over. She turned and ran. Branches caught at her clothes, pricking her face, but she did not stop. She heard the man shout something after her, and then steps that were clearly heading her way. She didn't know where she was running. Her body moved on its own, driven only by the desire to hide. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. Suddenly, she saw a slope that steeply descended. Without thinking, she headed there, going down as fast as she could. When she reached the bottom, her legs gave way, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air. She no longer heard steps behind her. The man seemed to have lost sight of her, but this brought no relief. Kaylin realized that now she was not just a casual visitor to this forest. Her actions with the bear cub and encounter with the poacher were intertwined in a chain of events that could no longer be stopped. She sat down, leaning against a tree, and listened to the forest again. The silence enveloped her once more, but this time there was something new in it, a premonition that her trials were far from over. Heavy breathing, Kaylin echoed in the quiet forest. She clenched her fists, feeling her fingers tremble with tension. Her heart was still pounding wildly, but in her chest there was no longer panic, only a bright, piercing determination. She looked back at the slope she had descended. The trail was no longer visible, and each step seemed to take her further from the familiar world. She knew the poacher was still nearby. His appearance was proof that her intuition had not failed. The trap was his doing, the bear cub a random victim of greed. She wiped the sweat from her face and stood up. Running further would be reckless, but staying in place was even more dangerous. She understood she needed to find a safe shelter and perhaps think about returning to the trail. But the thought of leaving this forest and putting everything behind her sparked a protest within her. The bear cub she had saved and the gaze of the mother bear, now living in her imagination, were a small reminder that evil lurked, hiding from it. Kaylin took a step forward, listening to every sound. Her gaze darted, searching for a safe path. The forest was no longer an enemy, but its power held a threat she did not yet know. The rustling of the wind in the treetops, the slight crackling of branches, everything merged into a symphony of tense anticipation. Suddenly, in the distance, voices were heard. She froze, listening. A man's voice, low and rough, interspersed with another, softer, as if observing. Kaylin realized the poacher was not alone. Now everything became much more serious. They could be looking for her, could reach the place where the trap was, or worse, hunt the mother bear. Her thoughts raced like a cornered animal. She could leave, just find the trail, and stay in the forest. But then what? The poachers would return, set new traps, causing even more pain and suffering. She pulled out her phone and looked at the screen. No signal, no way to call for help. Her support, her mind, and the knowledge she had inherited from her father. Do what you can with what you have. His words now echoed in her head. Kaylin turned towards the voices, carefully moving between the trees. Her steps were almost silent, but each one was difficult. Her heart told her she was doing the right thing, but her mind reminded her of the risk. She approached closer, hiding behind a thick pine trunk, and peeked through the branches. In the clearing stood two men. One of them, the same poacher she had seen earlier, was large, with a beard and a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other man was younger, his movements sharp, and he held cages in his hands. They were discussing something, looking at the tracks on the ground. One of them bent down, picked up the trap, clearly unhappy that it might be empty. Kaylin felt anger. This was a blatant violation of everything her father had taught her. Her gaze fell to the ground, where a branch lay, thick enough to serve as an improvised club. She desperately sought a plan to disarm them, or at least prevent further harm. She took a deep breath, considering her actions. Her presence could be noticed at any moment. If she did nothing, the mother bear and her cub would be in danger again. But one wrong move could cost her her life. Her gaze slid back to the poachers. They seemed absorbed in their activities. One muttered something, the other laughed, pointing at the tracks on the ground. She knew their overconfidence was her only chance. Kaylin made a decision. She picked up the branch and threw it far into the bushes. The sound of breaking branches instantly drew their attention. "What's that?" one of them asked loudly, noisily turning towards the sound. Both headed there, guns at the ready. Kaylin did not wait for them to leave. She knew she only had a few seconds. She headed towards their camp, which was now visible not far behind the trees. There lay cages, more traps, and a bag that apparently held their trophies. Her breathing quickened. She quickly approached the traps and began to overturn and break them. One of them was still intact, and she carefully released it, remembering how she had done it before. Every sound she made seemed loud, but there was no time to think about silence. When the traps were ruined, she threw them into the bushes and, gathering her courage, hid in the forest. Her heart was pounding as she heard the men approaching, reporting that their equipment had been ruined. "Who's there?" One of them growled angrily, stomping his foot. But Kaylin was already far away. She knew she had taken a risky step, but it was her choice. She could not allow evil to go unpunished. The forest became her ally again, hiding her steps and protecting her from the eyes of those who had disturbed its harmony. She walked forward, feeling a strange mix of fear and pride within her. She knew her actions might have changed the course of events. But ahead of her awaited an even greater trial, and the forest was clearly preparing new riddles for her. The forest embraced Kaylin with its cool silence, soothing her after the events that had unfolded in the clearing. She did not stop until she was sure the poachers were far behind. Her heart was still pounding, but the fear began to recede, leaving a sense of relief. She knew she had done everything possible to wake them up. Suddenly, through the dense foliage, a light broke through, soft, almost golden, as if the forest itself wanted to guide her to a new stage. Her tired, intense feet moved forward. She felt her journey was not yet complete. Somewhere within her was a quiet knowledge. She had to find the mother bear and make sure she and the cub were okay. A few more steps, and before her opened a small clearing. Here, time seemed to stand still. In the center stood the mother bear, her figure towering over the ground, as if embodying nature itself. Next to her, leaning on her mother, stood the bear cub. Its paw still looked weak, but it no longer trembled with pain. It turned out the mother was protecting it with her presence. Kaylin stopped at the edge of the clearing. She knew she could not come closer. The mother bear raised her head and met her gaze. In those eyes was everything: strength, caution, distrust, but most of all, understanding. This gaze pierced Kaylin to the very depths of her being. She slowly lowered her gaze, showing she did not intend to invade the mother bear's space. Her movements were slow and respectful. She squatted down to show she was not a threat and stayed just to observe. The mother bear took a few steps forward, her paws silently touching the ground. The bear cub remained in place, weakly whimpering, as if saying goodbye to the person who had helped it. Kaylin felt tears streaming down her cheeks. It was not tears of fear or relief. It was the realization of something greater. Between her and the wild creatures, there existed a thin but strong connection that did not require words. The mother bear stopped, and for a moment, absolute silence hung between them. It lasted for a few minutes, with quiet gratitude that nature could express only in this way. Then the grizzly softly growled, as if indicating it was time to go. She turned and slowly headed towards the trees, feeling a sense of completion. Kaylin sat still, not moving, until the figures of the mother bear and the cub disappeared into the depths of the forest. She felt part of something great, something that connected her with nature more strongly than ever before. Her thoughts returned to her father's words. Sometimes one good deed is enough to change the world, even if that world is just one creature. The sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Kaylin stood up, her body tired, but her heart light. She knew her journey into the forest was over, but this day would stay with her forever. When she returned to the trail and saw the familiar outlines of the road home, she looked back again. The forest lay behind her, but it no longer seemed like a simple sight. Now it was a living, breathing world, full of mystery, danger, and beauty. She smiled and took the first step towards home, knowing she would never forget this day and the lessons it had brought her.